Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're diving into something that's going to completely shatter everything you think you know about human survival. Picture this for a moment. You wake up tomorrow morning, step outside, and the world has transformed into a frozen wasteland. Temperatures have plummeted to -40 degrees. Ice sheets stretch beyond the horizon. The ground is rock solid for months on end. Your grocery stores are gone. Your heating system has failed. Your entire support network has vanished. How long do you think you'd last? A day? Maybe a week if you're really prepared. Now imagine not just surviving in those conditions, but thriving there for over 350,000 years. Not 350 days, not 350 weeks. 350,000 years of ice ages that make our worst winters look like a pleasant spring afternoon. This isn't some hypothetical scenario. This actually happened. And the people who pulled it off weren't some advanced technological civilization with heated buildings and supply chains. They were our ancient cousins, armed with nothing but stone tools. Animal, we're exploring the incredible story of the skins and the most remarkable survival instincts our species has ever developed. Today, Neanderthals, and I guarantee that by the end of this journey, you're going to see them in a completely different light. These weren't the knuckle-dragging cavemen that Hollywood loves to portray. They were sophisticated, intelligent, and arguably better adapted to extreme survival than we are today. They developed technologies that wouldn't be surpassed for hundreds of thousands of years. They created art, music, and complex social systems. They buried their dead with ceremony and care. They even interbred with our direct ancestors, meaning their genes flow through your veins right now. But here's what makes their story absolutely mind-blowing. They didn't just survive one ice age. They survived multiple glacial periods, each lasting tens of thousands of years. They watched massive ice sheets advance and retreat across entire continents. They adapted to climate changes that would collapse modern civilization. And they did it all while maintaining thriving communities, developing increasingly sophisticated technologies, and never losing their essentially human qualities. If you're fascinated by stories of incredible human resilience, and you want to understand what our species is truly capable of when survival is on the line, hit that subscribe button right now. We're about to embark on a journey through time that will show you capabilities you never knew existed in the human spirit. Let's start by setting the stage, because understanding what the Neanderthals accomplished requires grasping just how impossible their world really was. We're talking about Europe and parts of Asia during the Pleistocene epoch, roughly between 400,000 and 40,000 years ago. This wasn't just a colder version of the world we know today. This was an alien landscape that would challenge every assumption we have about where humans can live and how they can survive. During the height of glacial periods, ice sheets over a mile thick covered most of northern Europe. Imagine walls of ice taller than skyscrapers stretching as far as the eye can see. These weren't static formations either. They were constantly moving, grinding forward during cold periods and retreating during brief warm spells. The sound alone would have been incredible, like thunder that never stopped, as millions of tons of ice carved valleys and reshaped the landscape. South of these massive glaciers stretched endless tundra and grassland, broken only by scattered forests in protected valleys. This was a world of extremes, where temperatures could plummet to levels that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. Rivers froze solid for months at a time. Plant life disappeared completely during the worst periods. Even the animals that provided food would migrate vast distances or simply die off when conditions became too harsh. But here's what's absolutely remarkable. The Neanderthals didn't just cling to survival in a few protected refuges. They spread across this hostile landscape from Spain to Central Asia, from the Mediterranean coast all the way to the edge of the Arctic Circle. They were establishing communities and thriving in environments that would challenge our modern technology. Think about what this means. These people were building lives in places where the margin for error was essentially zero. One mistake in food storage could mean starvation. One poorly constructed shelter could mean freezing to death. One failed hunt could doom an entire community. Yet they not only survived these conditions, they actually expanded their territory during some of the harshest periods in Earth's recent history. Now let's talk about who these remarkable people actually were, because the physical evidence tells a fascinating story of adaptation. Neanderthals were built like biological machines perfectly engineered for their world. They were shorter and more powerfully constructed than modern humans, with barrel chests that housed larger lungs for processing frigid air. Their bones were incredibly dense and robust, designed to withstand the constant physical demands of Ice Age life. But here's where it gets really interesting. Their skulls tell a story that completely contradicts the primitive stereotype. Neanderthal brains were actually larger than ours. Not smaller, as old misconceptions suggested, but significantly bigger. Their brain cases could hold up to 1,600 cubic centimeters of neural tissue compared to our average of 1,400. This wasn't coincidence or some random evolutionary quirk. Surviving in their world required incredible mental processing power. Consider what their daily existence demanded. They had to track animal herds across vast distances while remembering the precise locations of tool-making materials scattered throughout their territory. They needed to understand complex seasonal patterns that determined when and where resources would be available. They had to coordinate sophisticated group hunts that required split-second timing and flawless execution. They were making life or death decisions constantly, and their enlarged brains were essentially supercomputers optimized for Ice Age survival. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed that Neanderthals possessed a level of technological sophistication that researchers are still trying to fully understand. They weren't just chipping rocks until they got sharp edges. They were creating precision instruments using techniques that required years to master, and an understanding of physics that would impress modern engineers. Their signature innovation was something called the Levallois technique, a method of stone tool production so advanced that it remained the cutting edge of human technology for over 200,000 years. This process involved preparing a stone core with such precision that when you struck it in exactly the right spot, it would produce a flake with predetermined shape and sharpness. Think about that level of planning and skill. You're looking at a raw piece of stone and visualizing the finished tool hidden inside it, then executing a complex sequence of strikes to bring that vision to reality. But they weren't just making one type of tool. Neanderthal sites contained dozens of different implement types, each designed for specific tasks: scrapers for preparing hides, points for spear tips, knives for butchering, burins for working bone and antler. They had developed what was essentially the world's first specialized toolkit, with each instrument optimized for particular applications. The sophistication shows up in the details too. When archaeologists examine cut marks on bones from Neanderthal sites, they see patterns that reveal systematic, efficient processing. These weren't random hack jobs by desperate survivors. These were methodical operations that maximized the use of every part of an animal. They knew exactly where to cut to remove hide in one piece for clothing or shelter. They understood which bones contained the richest marrow and how to crack them open without wasting any nutrition. Even more impressive was their mastery of fire. This wasn't just about keeping warm or cooking meat, though both were crucial. Neanderthals used fire as a sophisticated technology. They could maintain flames through brutal winter storms that lasted for months. They understood different types of fuel and how to bank fires overnight, so they could be restarted from embers. They even used fire to manufacture tools, heating wooden spear points to harden them, and creating the world's first adhesives by processing birch bark into pitch. Fire was literally life in their world. Without it, there was no way to cook meat to make it digestible, no warmth to prevent freezing, no light to extend productive hours, and no protection from the massive predators that shared their landscape. The Neanderthals didn't just use fire, they mastered it in ways that allowed them to expand into environments where fire-making materials were scarce and weather conditions were constantly trying to extinguish their flames. This mastery extended to their understanding of the landscape itself. Neanderthals developed an intimate knowledge of their territories that went far beyond what we might imagine possible. They knew where to find the best stone for tools, sometimes travelling dozens of miles to specific quarries. They understood seasonal patterns of plant growth and animal migration with precision that allowed them to predict resource availability months in advance. Recent studies have revealed something remarkable about their territorial knowledge. They weren't just wandering randomly across the landscape, hoping to stumble upon resources. They were following specific routes, returning to the same locations year after year, generation after generation. They had developed mental maps of their world that included not just physical features, but seasonal timings, resource availability, and optimal camping spots. This suggests a level of cultural transmission that rivals anything we see in modern hunter-gatherer societies. Knowledge was being passed down from parents to children, from experienced hunters to novices, creating cumulative wisdom that grew more sophisticated over time. And they were sharing this knowledge not just within groups, but between distant communities. Evidence shows that Neanderthal communities were in contact across vast distances, sharing innovations in toolmaking, hunting techniques, and survival strategies. Raw materials found at archaeological sites sometimes came from sources hundreds of miles away, indicating trade networks or at least regular contact between groups separated by enormous distances. This wasn't the isolated, brutish existence that early anthropologists imagined. This was a connected, communicating network of human communities spread across Ice Age Europe and Asia, sharing knowledge and resources in ways that enhanced everyone's survival chances. They were maintaining these connections while dealing with environmental conditions that would challenge modern transportation and communication systems. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their achievement was the sheer duration of their success. We're not talking about a few lucky generations that happened to survive difficult times. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of years of continuous adaptation to some of the most challenging environments Earth has ever presented to human life. This wasn't accident or good fortune. This was intelligence, culture, and technology working together to create one of the most successful human adaptations in our entire evolutionary history. And they were doing all of this while maintaining stable populations, developing increasingly sophisticated technologies, and never losing the essentially human qualities that made their communities more than just survival groups. They were creating meaning, beauty, and culture, even in conditions that would crush most modern societies. In our next segment, we're going to dive deep into their hunting strategies, because what the Neanderthals accomplished as predators will absolutely blow your mind. They weren't just taking down deer and rabbits, they were hunting giants. We're talking about mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, cave bears that stood 12 feet tall on their hind legs. These weren't just large animals, these were walking fortresses of muscle, bone, and fury that could destroy an entire human hunting party with a single charge. And yet, Neanderthal communities were taking down these giants so regularly that their remains show up at archaeological sites across their entire range. Picture a mature bull mammoth for a moment, nearly 14 feet at the shoulder, weighing as much as 4 modern elephants, carrying tusks longer than a grown human that could pierce through solid wood. Its hide was thick enough to turn away most weapons, and its intelligence rivaled that of any creature on the planet. This wasn't prey in any conventional sense. This was a mobile mountain of death that could trample you, gore you, or grab you with its trunk and fling you like a rag doll. Now imagine hunting that animal with nothing but wooden spears tipped with stone points. No metal weapons, no gunpowder, no vehicles or machinery of any kind. Just human intelligence, coordination, and raw courage applied to a challenge that would make modern big game hunters think twice, even with high-powered rifles. The evidence for how they pulled this off comes from kill sites scattered across Europe and Asia. And what archaeologists have found there reveals hunting strategies so sophisticated they challenge our understanding of what Stone Age humans were capable of. These weren't desperate ambushes or lucky accidents. These were planned military operations that required levels of tactical thinking and flawless execution that would impress modern special forces. At Leringen in Germany, researchers discovered a perfectly preserved wooden spear embedded between the ribs of a straight-tusked elephant. The angle of penetration, the depth of the wound, and the surrounding evidence revealed that this wasn't a random throw from a panicked hunter. This was a precision strike delivered at exactly the right moment in a carefully orchestrated attack sequence. But here's the thing: individual spear throws, no matter how accurate, couldn't bring down a healthy mammoth. The archaeological evidence shows that successful mammoth hunting required coordinated group tactics that pushed the boundaries of what we thought possible for prehistoric societies. Multiple spear points found in single carcasses reveal strike patterns that could only result from simultaneous attacks by hunters positioned at strategic points around the animal. Think about the coordination this required. First, they had to track a mammoth herd across potentially hundreds of miles of territory, reading subtle signs in frozen ground and sparse vegetation that told them where the animals were heading and when they would arrive. Mammoths weren't wandering randomly. They followed established migration routes and had predictable feeding patterns that experienced hunters could anticipate and exploit. Once they located a suitable target, hunting parties had to coordinate an approach that could position multiple hunters within striking distance of an animal whose senses were acute enough to detect human presence from vast distances. This required understanding mammoth psychology, knowing how these intelligent animals would react to different stimuli, and timing the final approach to coincide with moments when the target would be most vulnerable. The kill itself demanded split-second timing and absolute precision. Recent analysis of mammoth bone trauma patterns suggests that successful hunts targeted specific anatomical points that could disable or kill the animal quickly enough to prevent escape or retaliation. They weren't throwing spears randomly and hoping for the best. They had developed detailed anatomical knowledge that allowed them to identify exactly where to strike for maximum effect. Some evidence suggests they targeted areas behind the front legs where weapons could reach vital organs. Other sites indicate they aimed for tendons and joints that could cripple the animal's mobility. The most dramatic evidence comes from locations where spear points are found embedded in skull bones, revealing that some hunters were skilled and brave enough to attempt killing strikes to the brain. But perhaps most remarkably, they had developed techniques for avoiding the mammoth's devastating defensive capabilities during these attacks. Those massive tusks weren't just for show. They were precision weapons that these intelligent animals knew how to use effectively. A single sweep could kill multiple humans instantly. The trunk could grab and crush attackers. Even a defensive charge could flatten anything in its path. Neanderthal hunters had to approach these dangers with strategies that kept them within striking distance while remaining outside the mammoth's kill zone. This required understanding the animal's reach, reaction times, and likely defensive movements. They needed to identify split-second windows when attacks could be delivered safely. The evidence suggests they developed what military strategists would recognize as combined arms tactics. While some hunters engaged the mammoth's attention from the front, others positioned themselves for strikes from the sides or rear. Some may have used fire or noise to control the animal's movement, directing it towards terrain features that provided advantages for the hunting party. And they had backup plans for when things went wrong, because mammoth hunting was inherently dangerous. Even the most skilled parties would face situations where their initial strategy failed, and they needed to adapt instantly to survive. Archaeological evidence suggests they had developed escape routes, fallback positions, and alternative attack strategies that could be implemented when primary plans collapsed. The communication challenge alone was extraordinary. During a hunt, participants might be positioned hundreds of meters apart, operating in terrain that blocked visual contact, coordinating attacks that required precise timing despite the chaos of engaging a massive, terrified animal. They needed signals that could be understood instantly in conditions of poor visibility, high stress, and life-threatening danger. Some researchers believe they used animal calls or acoustic signals that could carry over long distances without alerting their prey. Others suggest gestural communication systems that could convey complex tactical information through brief visual contact. The most intriguing possibility is that they had developed field command structures with experienced hunt leaders coordinating overall strategy while individual hunters executed specific roles. But tactical coordination was just one piece of the puzzle. They also had to solve the massive logistical challenges of processing and preserving meat from animals that provided more food than a community could consume before spoilage. A single mammoth carcass contained enough protein to feed 30 people for months, but only if they could butcher, preserve, and store it effectively. The archaeological record reveals that Neanderthals had developed sophisticated butchering techniques that could break down a mammoth with remarkable efficiency. Cut marks on bones show systematic patterns that reveal deep understanding of anatomy and optimal processing sequences. They knew exactly where to make cuts to separate different muscle groups, how to remove hide in usable pieces, and which bones contained the richest marrow deposits. Speed was critical. In the temperatures of Ice Age Europe, exposed meat would begin spoiling within days, and the scent of a fresh kill would attract every predator in the region. Communities had to mobilize their entire population for intensive processing operations that could transform a carcass into preserved food stores before the meat became unusable or dangerous scavengers arrived. This processing required tools, techniques, and organizational systems that went far beyond anything needed for smaller game. They needed cutting implements capable of slicing through hide several inches thick. They required methods for separating different tissue types efficiently. They had to master preservation techniques that could keep meat edible for months without refrigeration or chemical additives. Recent experimental archaeology has shown just how sophisticated these processing systems were. When modern researchers attempt to butcher large animals using reconstructed tools and techniques, they consistently find that ancient methods are more efficient than contemporary approaches for specific tasks. Scrapers remove tissue more completely than modern implements. Bone-cracking techniques extract marrow more efficiently than mechanical alternatives. They weren't making do with primitive equipment. They were using optimized technologies that had been refined over hundreds of thousands of years of experience. Every tool design, every technique, every step in their processing sequence had been tested and improved through countless generations of mammoth hunters. The preservation methods they developed were equally sophisticated. Evidence from multiple sites shows they had mastered techniques for smoking meat, creating dried strips for long-term storage, and rendering fat for preservation and cooking. Some locations reveal underground storage pits lined with stones and sealed with clay that could keep provisions fresh through entire winter seasons. They also developed methods for utilizing every part of the carcass. Bones became tools, shelter materials, and fuel for fires. Hides provided clothing, shelter coverings, and containers. Tusks were carved into implements and decorative objects. Even mammoth hair was used for insulation and cordage. This comprehensive utilization wasn't just about avoiding waste. It was about maximizing the return on the enormous investment of time, energy, and risk that mammoth hunting represented. These hunts were major community undertakings that involved months of planning and significant danger to participants. To justify that investment, every possible benefit had to be extracted from successful kills. The most remarkable aspect wasn't the tactical sophistication or logistical complexity, though. It was the psychological and social implications of regularly engaging in activities that required levels of courage, skill, and coordination that pushed human capabilities to their absolute limits. Think about what it means for a community to organize hunts that deliberately seek out the most dangerous animals on the planet. This wasn't subsistence hunting driven by desperation or starvation. Neanderthals had access to plenty of other food sources that were far safer and more predictable than mammoth hunting. Deer, horses, reindeer, smaller game that could feed a family without risking everyone's lives in the process. They chose to pursue these giants because mammoth kills provided benefits that went way beyond simple nutrition. A successful mammoth hunt was a statement. It demonstrated community capability, individual courage, and collective coordination in ways that reinforced social bonds and cultural identity like nothing else could. These hunts were proving grounds where young hunters could demonstrate their readiness for full adult status, where experienced leaders could reinforce their authority through skill and bravery, and where the entire community could affirm its strength and unity in the face of overwhelming challenges. The psychological impact of successfully taking down a creature that could easily destroy your entire group must have been extraordinary. Archaeological evidence suggests that mammoth hunting had ritual and ceremonial dimensions that went far beyond practical food procurement. Some kill sites show deliberate arrangement of mammoth bones in patterns that suggest symbolic meaning. Others include deposits of red ochre, carved objects, or other items that appear to have ritual rather than practical significance. These ceremonial elements reveal that mammoth hunting had become integrated into Neanderthal spiritual and cultural systems in ways that made it central to community identity and meaning-making. These hunts weren't just about getting food. They were about affirming human ability to engage with the most powerful forces in their world and emerge victorious through skill, courage, and cooperation. This psychological dimension may have been crucial for maintaining community morale during the long, dark winters of Ice Age Europe. When survival required extraordinary effort and sacrifice from every community member, the memory of successful mammoth hunts provided concrete evidence that human determination and intelligence could overcome even the most overwhelming obstacles. The stories told around winter fires about these hunts served multiple functions. They preserved tactical knowledge for future expeditions. They reinforced social bonds between participants. And they provided inspiration for facing other challenges that required similar levels of courage and coordination. These weren't just entertainment. They were cultural technologies for maintaining psychological resilience in conditions that tested human endurance to its absolute limits. The skills developed through mammoth hunting transferred to other aspects of Neanderthal life in ways that enhanced their overall survival capabilities. The tactical thinking required for coordinating complex hunts improved their ability to organize other group activities. The precision and timing needed for successful attacks enhanced their general problem-solving abilities. The courage and determination required for engaging dangerous megafauna strengthened their psychological resilience for facing all types of challenges. Mammoth hunting wasn't just one survival strategy among many. It was a comprehensive training system that developed physical, mental, and social capabilities that enhanced Neanderthal effectiveness across every aspect of Ice Age existence. Communities that successfully hunted mammoths weren't just better fed. They were stronger, smarter, more coordinated, and more psychologically resilient than groups that avoided these ultimate challenges. This may explain why evidence of mammoth hunting appears consistently across Neanderthal sites throughout their range and throughout their entire 350,000-year history. It wasn't a desperate expedient or rare occurrence. It was a central element of Neanderthal culture that contributed directly to their remarkable success in Ice Age environments. But mammoth hunting also reveals something profound about Neanderthal relationships with their environment. These weren't people who saw themselves as separate from or superior to the natural world. They were participants in ecological systems that included the most powerful and dangerous animals on Earth. And they had found ways to engage with those systems that enhanced, rather than disrupted, their long-term stability. Archaeological evidence suggests that Neanderthal mammoth hunting was sustainable over the long term. they weren't overhunting mammoth populations or depleting the herds they depended on. Instead, they had developed hunting practices that removed individual animals without damaging the overall population dynamics that kept mammoth herds healthy and productive. This sustainable approach required deep understanding of mammoth behavior, herd breeding patterns, when hunts could be conducted without interf population dynamics and ecological relationships. Neanderthal hunters had to knowing with migration cycles and how hunting which animals could be taken without disrupting H pressure should be distributed across different herds and territories to maintain long-term population stability. The knowledge systems required for this level of ecological management were extraordinary in their sophistication and scope. Neanderthal communities were maintaining detailed information about animal populations across vast territories, tracking changes in herd sizes over multiple generations, and coordinating hunting activities among different human groups to ensure sustainable resource use. This wasn't primitive opportunism. This was advanced ecological management that allowed human communities to extract significant resources from their environment while maintaining the long-term health and productivity of the systems they depended on. Neanderthals had achieved sustainable harvesting practices using only Stone Age technologies and traditional ecological knowledge. And they maintained these practices successfully for hundreds of thousands of years through multiple ice ages and dramatic environmental changes across territories that spanned entire continents. This represents one of the longest-running examples of sustainable resource management in human history, achieved by people who are often dismissed as primitive and unsophisticated. Now let's shift our focus to something equally remarkable but completely different in character. Because while Neanderthals were mastering the art of hunting giants, they were also developing technologies for surviving the brutal winters that defined their world. And what they accomplished in terms of shelter construction and thermal management will completely change how you think about Stone Age innovation. Picture trying to stay warm when outside temperatures drop to -40 degrees Fahrenheit and stay there for months at a time. Your breath freezes instantly. Exposed skin can suffer frostbite in minutes. The cold penetrates everything, making metal tools too painful to handle and turning leather stiff as boards. Modern humans in these conditions rely on sophisticated heating systems, insulated buildings, and specialized clothing that incorporates advanced materials and engineering. Neanderthals had none of these advantages. No electricity, no fossil fuels, no manufactured materials of any kind. Just stone, wood, bone, hide, and human ingenuity applied to one of the most fundamental challenges any species can face: staying alive when your environment is actively trying to kill you through thermal exposure. Yet archaeological evidence reveals that they developed shelter technology so sophisticated that some of their innovations wouldn't be matched again until the modern era. At sites across Europe, researchers have found evidence of structures that represent masterpieces of cold weather engineering achieved with nothing but natural materials and traditional knowledge. At Molodova in Ukraine, archaeologists discovered the remains of a Neanderthal dwelling that defies every stereotype about primitive cave dwellers. This wasn't a crude hut thrown together for temporary protection. This was a carefully engineered structure built from mammoth bones and designed according to principles that modern architects would recognize as brilliant solutions to extreme climate challenges. The foundation consisted of mammoth skulls arranged in a precise circle, creating a stable base that could support significant weight while providing insulation from ground frost. The walls were constructed from interlocked mammoth bones, primarily long bones and tusks, arranged to create maximum structural integrity while minimizing gaps that could allow heat loss. But here's where it gets really impressive. The builders had incorporated sophisticated ventilation systems that could maintain air quality while preventing heat loss. They understood that completely sealing a structure would lead to carbon monoxide poisoning from their fires, but they also knew that too much ventilation would make heating impossible. The solution they developed involved carefully positioned gaps between bones that created controlled airflow patterns. Fresh air entered at low levels, circulated around the living space to pick up heat from central fires, and exited through higher openings that prevented backdrafts. This wasn't accidental. This was deliberate engineering based on deep understanding of thermodynamics and air circulation principles. The roof structure was equally sophisticated. Rather than simply covering the bone walls with hides, they created multi-layered systems that incorporated different materials for different functions. Inner layers provided immediate weather protection. Middle layers offered insulation through trapped air spaces. Outer layers were designed to shed water and resist wind damage. Some structures show evidence of entrance systems that function like airlocks, preventing heat loss when people moved in and out. Others include evidence of interior partitions that could separate different functional areas while maintaining overall thermal efficiency. These weren't just shelters. They were climate-controlled living spaces designed by master engineers working with Stone Age materials. The heating systems they developed were equally remarkable. Rather than relying on simple campfires that would consume enormous amounts of fuel while providing uneven heat distribution, Neanderthals created sophisticated thermal management systems that maximized efficiency while minimizing resource consumption. At many sites, archaeologists have found evidence of structured hearths that incorporated heat storage and distribution principles. Stones were arranged to absorb heat during active burning periods and release it slowly over extended time periods. Some hearths include channels or ducts that could direct heated air to specific areas of the dwelling. Even more impressive were the fuel management strategies they developed. In environments where wood was scarce and temperatures were extreme, inefficient burning could mean the difference between survival and death. Neanderthals learned to use different materials for different heating purposes, burning bone for long-lasting coals, using fat for high-temperature flames, and employing specific wood types for particular thermal characteristics. They also developed techniques for banking fires that could maintain heat sources through long winter nights without constant attention. This involved understanding how different fuel arrangements would burn at different rates, how to create coal beds that could smolder for hours, and how to restart active flames from carefully maintained ember cores. The clothing systems they created were equally sophisticated and represented another area where Neanderthal innovation reached levels that wouldn't be surpassed for tens of thousands of years. These weren't simple animal skins thrown over shoulders for basic protection. These were tailored garment systems designed according to principles that modern outdoor equipment manufacturers would recognize as state-of-the-art cold weather technology. Archaeological evidence from multiple sites reveals that Neanderthals were creating fitted clothing using techniques that required sophisticated understanding of pattern making, material properties, and thermal layering principles. They were cutting hides into specific shapes that could be assembled into three-dimensional garments that followed body contours for maximum efficiency. The tools they developed for clothing construction were precision instruments that allowed detailed work on different material types. Bone needles with carefully drilled eyes enabled fine stitching that could create weatherproof seams. Specialized scrapers could process hides to different thicknesses depending on their intended use. Cutting tools were designed to slice leather cleanly without creating weak points that could lead to garment failure. But the real sophistication shows up in the layering systems they developed. Rather than relying on single heavy garments that would restrict movement while providing inconsistent protection, they created multi-layer clothing systems that could be adjusted for different activity levels and environmental conditions. Inner layers were designed for moisture management, using materials and techniques that could keep skin dry during periods of high exertion. Middle layers provided insulation through trapped air systems created by specific hide preparation techniques. Outer layers were engineered for weather protection, using materials and construction methods that could shed water while resisting wind penetration. Some evidence suggests they were creating specialized garments for different activities and environmental conditions. Hunting gear that prioritized mobility and weather protection. Work clothing designed for durability and flexibility. ceremonial garments that incorporated decorative elements while maintaining functional effectiveness. The footwear they developed deserves special mention because protecting feet in extreme cold while maintaining mobility across varied terrain represents one of the most challenging aspects of cold weather survival. Modern cold weather boots incorporate advanced materials, sophisticated insulation systems, and complex construction techniques developed through decades of research and testing. Neanderthals solved the same problems using Stone Age materials and traditional knowledge, creating footwear systems that provided effective protection in conditions that would challenge modern equipment. Archaeological evidence suggests they were using multiple materials in layered systems that provided insulation, weather protection, and traction across different surface types. But perhaps most remarkably, they were doing all of this while maintaining the flexibility and durability needed for the constant movement that Ice Age survival required. These weren't just survival expedients thrown together in desperate circumstances. These were refined technologies developed over hundreds of thousands of years and optimized for specific environmental challenges and lifestyle requirements. The sophistication of Neanderthal cold weather technology reveals minds that were capable of complex engineering thinking, long-term planning, and systematic problem-solving at levels that challenge our assumptions about Stone Age capabilities. They weren't just reacting to environmental challenges as they arose. They were anticipating problems, developing comprehensive solutions, and refining those solutions over multiple generations. And they were sharing this technological knowledge across their entire range through the same communication networks that transmitted hunting strategies and tool-making techniques. Evidence from sites separated by thousands of miles shows similar approaches to shelter construction, heating systems, and clothing technology, suggesting cultural transmission systems that could spread innovations rapidly throughout Neanderthal communities. This technological sophistication was crucial for their survival success, but it also reveals something deeper about Neanderthal psychology and social organization. Developing these technologies required communities that could support specialists, maintain knowledge across generations, and invest time and resources in long-term projects that might not provide immediate benefits. These weren't desperate people scraping by from day to day. These were sophisticated societies that could plan ahead, accumulate resources, and dedicate effort to developing technologies that would enhance community welfare over extended time periods. They had created social systems that could support expertise across generations, and innovation, preserve knowledge, and transmit. They were doing all of this while facing environmental challenges that would test any human society to its absolute limits. The combination of technological sophistication and social organization that allowed them to thrive in Ice Age conditions represents one of the most remarkable achievements in human history. In our next segment, we're going to explore something that will fundamentally change how you see Neanderthal intelligence and consciousness. Because recent discoveries have revealed that these remarkable people weren't just master survivors and brilliant engineers. They were also artists, musicians, and spiritual thinkers who created expressions of beauty and meaning that rival anything found in modern human cultures. We're about to dive into discoveries that will completely shatter every assumption you've ever had about prehistoric human consciousness. Because while Neanderthals were perfecting their survival technologies and hunting strategies, they were simultaneously developing something that archaeologists are still struggling to fully comprehend. They were creating art, music, and symbolic expressions that reveal minds operating at the highest levels of human consciousness. Let me paint you a picture that's going to blow your mind. Imagine descending into a cave system in Spain, your headlamp cutting through absolute darkness as you navigate narrow passages that haven't seen sunlight for tens of thousands of years. You're crawling through spaces barely wide enough for your shoulders, following archaeological teams who are about to make one of the most groundbreaking discoveries in human history. Then your light hits the cave wall, and you freeze, because covering the limestone surfaces around you are paintings that shouldn't exist. red ochre handprints pressed against stone with deliberate precision, geometric patterns that seemed to be understood for millennia to follow mathematical principles, that wooden and shading techniques that display animal figures rendered with perspective. Here's the kicker. These aren't modern and artistic sophistication that takes your breath away. And human creations. They're not even from the period when modern humans first reached Europe. The dating results came back showing these masterpieces were created over 20,000 years before modern humans even set 65,000 years ago, at least foot on European soil. These are Neanderthal cave paintings, and they represent artistic achievements that completely rewrite our understanding of prehistoric human consciousness. But cave art was just the beginning of what researchers were about to uncover. Because as archaeological teams began examining Neanderthal sites with fresh eyes and new technologies, they started finding evidence of cognitive abilities that seemed impossible for people we'd dismissed as primitive brutes. Evidence of symbolic thinking, abstract reasoning, and creative expression that revealed minds capable of the deepest forms of human consciousness. At Bruniquel Cave in France, archaeologists made a discovery that took years to fully comprehend. Deep underground, in chambers that required crawling through treacherous passages to reach, Neanderthals had constructed elaborate circular arrangements from broken stalagmites, not randomly, not accidentally, but with deliberate architectural precision that required planning, coordination, and hours of back-breaking labor in complete darkness. These weren't small constructions either. We're talking about massive structures containing over 400 individual pieces, carefully selected and positioned to create geometric patterns over 20 feet across. The builders had to break stalagmites to specific lengths, transport them through narrow passages that modern cavers find challenging, and arrange them according to designs that existed only in their minds. And they accomplished this 176,000 years ago, making these the oldest known human constructions on Earth. Think about what this reveals about their consciousness. These weren't people simply reacting to environmental pressures or following basic survival instincts. These were minds capable of conceiving abstract designs, planning complex projects, and investing enormous effort in creating something that served no practical survival function whatsoever. They were building monumental art in underground galleries that no one would see for nearly 200,000 years. This was pure creative expression, geometric imagination, and what we can only call aesthetic vision, operating at levels that challenge everything we thought we knew about prehistoric human capabilities. The evidence keeps expanding in ways that force us to completely reconsider Neanderthal consciousness. At sites across Europe, researchers are finding artifacts that reveal increasingly sophisticated symbolic thinking. Perforated shells that were clearly used as jewelry or personal ornaments. Eagle talons with deliberate cut marks suggesting they were collected and worn as pendants or status symbols. Chunks of manganese and red ochre that show wear patterns indicating they were used as crayons for body painting or artistic expression. But perhaps most remarkably of all, they were creating what can only be described as music. At multiple archaeological sites, teams have discovered bone flutes with carefully drilled holes positioned to produce specific musical scales. These aren't crude noisemakers or accidental perforations. These are precision instruments that required understanding of acoustic principles, mathematical relationships between tone frequencies, and the manual skill to create perfectly positioned sound holes. The Divya Babe flute, discovered in Slovenia, dates to over 60,000 years ago and produces tones that align with modern musical scales. When researchers created exact replicas and tested them, they found that these ancient instruments could play recognizable melodies, suggesting that Neanderthal communities had developed not just individual musical expression, but possibly shared musical traditions that required teaching, learning, and cultural transmission across generations. Music represents one of the highest forms of abstract human thought. It serves no immediate survival function. It requires cognitive abilities that go far beyond practical problem solving. It demands the capacity to create and appreciate patterns that exist purely in time and sound, to find beauty in mathematical relationships, and to express emotions and ideas that can't be communicated through any other medium. The fact that Neanderthals were creating sophisticated musical instruments reveals minds operating at the highest levels of human consciousness. They weren't just surviving in their harsh environment. They were finding ways to create beauty, express meaning, and explore dimensions of experience that went far beyond the immediate demands of Ice Age existence. And they were sharing these cultural innovations across vast distances and time periods. Similar artistic techniques, comparable symbolic objects, and related musical instruments appear at Neanderthal sites separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. This suggests cultural networks that could transmit abstract ideas, aesthetic preferences, and creative innovations across their entire range. We're not talking about isolated communities developing these capabilities independently. We're looking at evidence of sophisticated communication systems that could share across continental distances. They had created what anthrop the most complex aspects of human culture. Ologists recognize as cultural universals shared approaches examine their treatment of death, because Neandertication of their consciousness becomes most apparent when weakened local environmental conditions. But the sophist to symbolic expression and meaning-making that transc, and spiritual meaning that rival anything found in modern human cultures. They weren't just disposing of bodies when community members died. They were engaging how burial practices reveal concepts about mortality, identity happens after death, and what obligations the living have in complex rituals that suggest profound beliefs about what to the deceased. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, archaeologists discovered burial sites that tell stories of extraordinary emotional and spiritual depth. One grave contained the remains of an elderly Neanderthal who had been severely disabled for years before his death. His arm was withered and useless from an old injury. His skull showed signs of traumatic brain damage that would have left him partially blind and cognitively impaired. Yet this individual had been cared for by his community, fed and protected for years, despite being unable to contribute to group survival in any traditional sense. The level of care required to keep someone alive in Ice Age conditions after such devastating injuries reveals more than just practical cooperation. It reveals emotional bonds, moral commitments, and possibly spiritual beliefs about the value of individual life that go far beyond simple survival calculations. This community chose to invest precious resources in caring for someone who couldn't reciprocate, suggesting ethical systems that prioritized compassion over efficiency, human dignity over practical utility. They had developed what we can only call moral consciousness, the ability to make decisions based on principles that transcended immediate self-interest or group advantage. But the burial itself tells an even more remarkable story. The body was placed in a carefully prepared grave, positioned in a specific orientation that suggests deliberate symbolism. Analysis of soil samples from around the burial revealed pollen from flowers that grow only during specific seasons and would have required intentional collection and placement. While debates continue about whether flowers were actually placed in Neanderthal graves, the pattern of intentional burial with symbolic elements appears consistently across their sites. Bodies positioned in meaningful ways, tools placed alongside the deceased, red ochre scattered over remains in patterns that suggest ritual significance. These burial practices reveal beliefs about death that go far beyond simple disposal of corpses. They suggest concepts about personal identity that persists after physical death, about relationships between the living and the deceased that continue beyond mortality, about spiritual dimensions of existence that transcend immediate material reality. Neanderthals had developed what religious scholars recognize as spiritual consciousness, the ability to conceive of meanings and realities that exist beyond the physical world. They were grappling with the fundamental questions that continue to challenge human understanding today. What happens when we die? Do our relationships and identities survive physical death? What do the living owe to those who have passed away? And this spiritual sophistication extended to their relationship with the natural world around them. Recent analysis of Neanderthal sites has revealed evidence of what can only be called ritual behavior connected to natural phenomena. Stone circles arranged to align with celestial events, collections of unusual stones, crystals, and fossils that serve no practical purpose but appear to have been valued for their aesthetic or symbolic properties. At some locations, researchers have found caches of beautiful but functionally useless objects, perfectly spherical stones that required no tools to create, but were clearly selected for their geometric perfection. Crystals with unusual formations that catch and reflect light in striking ways. Fossils of ancient sea creatures found hundreds of miles from any ocean, suggesting they were collected and transported specifically for their symbolic or aesthetic value. These collections reveal minds capable of appreciating beauty for its own sake, of finding meaning in objects that served no survival function but possessed qualities that appealed to aesthetic sensibilities. This capacity for aesthetic appreciation represents cognitive abilities that philosophers have long considered unique to the highest forms of human consciousness. Neanderthals possessed what we might call contemplative awareness, the mental capacity to step back from immediate survival concerns and engage with the world as a source of wonder and meaning. They could perceive beauty, find significance in natural forms and patterns, collect and preserve objects not for their utility, but for their ability to inspire, comfort, or connect them to larger realities. But their consciousness operated in ways that may have been fundamentally different from and, in some respects, superior to modern human cognition. Recent neuroscience research suggests that Neanderthal brains were organized differently from ours, with enhanced development in regions associated with visual processing, spatial reasoning, and what researchers call embodied intelligence. Their larger brain size wasn't just about raw computational power. It reflected different cognitive architectures that may have given them capabilities that modern humans actually lack. Their enhanced visual processing may have allowed them to perceive details and patterns in their environment that we simply cannot detect. Their superior spatial reasoning may have enabled them to navigate and understand three-dimensional relationships with precision that exceeds modern human abilities. Some researchers propose that Neanderthals possessed what they call immediate consciousness, a form of awareness that was more directly connected to sensory experience and environmental information than our more abstract, language-mediated thinking. They may have experienced the world with an intensity and directness that our verbal, conceptual approaches to reality actually diminish or interfere with. This different form of consciousness might explain some of their remarkable survival capabilities. Their ability to track animals across vast distances by reading environmental cues that modern humans overlook. Their precision in crafting tools that required understanding complex material properties through direct sensory feedback. Their success in surviving ice age conditions that challenge our most advanced technologies. But it might also explain why their cultural expressions were so deeply connected to immediate experience rather than abstract symbolism. Their art focused on direct representations of animals and natural phenomena rather than symbolic abstractions. Their music emphasized acoustic beauty and emotional expression rather than complex harmonic structures. Their rituals centered on tangible objects and physical locations rather than elaborate conceptual frameworks. This isn't a limitation of their consciousness. It represents a different way of being aware, one that may have provided access to aspects of reality that our more abstract thinking actually obscures or disconnects us from. Neanderthals may have experienced a form of integrated awareness that was more embodied, more directly connected to the natural world, and more immediately present than our modern cognition typically allows. And this integrated consciousness may have been crucial for their extraordinary survival success. because thriving in Ice Age environments required forms of awareness that could process vast amounts of environmental information simultaneously, integrate sensory data from multiple sources instantly, and respond to complex ecological relationships in real time. Modern humans often struggle with information overload, with the difficulty of processing multiple sensory inputs at once, with the challenge of making intuitive decisions in complex situations. We tend to break down complex problems into abstract categories that we can analyze separately. But this analytical approach can miss the integrated patterns that emerge from whole systems. Neanderthal consciousness appears to have been optimized for exactly these challenges, providing forms of awareness that could handle the cognitive demands of Ice Age survival more effectively than our fragmented, analytical thinking typically manages. They could perceive their environment as integrated wholes rather than collections of separate elements. But their consciousness also included capabilities for symbolic thought, creative expression, and spiritual meaning-making that rivaled anything found in modern human cultures. They weren't just surviving in their world, they were finding ways to create beauty, express meaning, and explore questions about existence that went far beyond immediate practical concerns. The cave paintings, the musical instruments, the burial rituals, the symbolic objects, all of these reveal minds that were asking fundamental questions about the nature of reality, the meaning of life, the significance of death, and humanity's place in the larger cosmos. These weren't primitive people struggling with basic survival. These were conscious beings grappling with the deepest philosophical and spiritual questions that continue to challenge human understanding today. And their approach to these ultimate questions may have been more sophisticated than we initially realized. Because while modern human consciousness tends to separate the practical from the spiritual, the material from the symbolic, the functional from the aesthetic, Neanderthal awareness appears to have integrated these dimensions of experience in ways that created more holistic understanding. Their tools weren't just functional objects. They were expressions of aesthetic sensibility, demonstrations of skill, and possibly spiritual instruments that connected them to the natural forces they were working with. Their art wasn't separate from their survival activities. It was integrated into their understanding of the world as a living, meaningful system that responded to human presence and intention. Their rituals weren't disconnected from their practical activities. They were ways of engaging with the spiritual dimensions of hunting, gathering, tool-making, and community life that recognize the sacred aspects of all human activities. Neanderthal consciousness achieved forms of integration between practical and spiritual awareness that our more compartmentalized thinking struggles to comprehend. This integrated approach to consciousness may explain how Neanderthal communities were able to maintain cultural continuity for over 350,000 years. They had developed forms of awareness that could hold together all the different dimensions of human existence, practical, social, aesthetic, and spiritual, in ways that created resilient, meaningful, sustainable approaches to life. Modern human consciousness, for all its analytical power and abstract capabilities, often struggles with integration. We separate science from spirituality, art from function, individual needs from community welfare, immediate concerns from long-term consequences. This compartmentalization gives us powerful tools for specialized thinking, but it can also create fragmentation that undermines our ability to create coherent, sustainable ways of life. Neanderthal consciousness suggests alternative possibilities, ways of being aware that can hold together the full spectrum of human experience without losing coherence or depth. Forms of thinking that can be simultaneously practical and spiritual, individual and communal, immediate and long-term, analytical and intuitive. And traces of this integrated consciousness may persist in modern humans through the genetic and cultural inheritance we received from Neanderthal communities during the period of interbreeding and cultural exchange. When we experience moments of intuitive understanding that bypass analytical thought, when we feel deep connections to natural environments that transcend rational explanation, when we create art or music that seems to emerge from sources beyond conscious intention, we may be accessing aspects of consciousness that were more fully developed in our ancient relatives. The meditation traditions found in cultures around the world often describe states of awareness that sound remarkably similar to what we might expect from Neanderthal consciousness. Direct, immediate awareness of present moment experience. Integration of sensory, emotional, and cognitive processing. Decreased separation between self and environment. Enhanced perception of subtle patterns and relationships that analytical thinking might miss. These contemplative states are often described as revealing deeper truths about the nature of reality, suggesting that the forms of consciousness Neanderthals may have possessed naturally could provide access to dimensions of understanding that our ordinary analytical, we shouldn't romanticize Neanderthal consciousness or assume it thinking overlooks or disconnects us from. But different forms of consciousness have different strengths and limitations. Modern was superior to modern human awareness. In every respect, human analytical thinking has enabled achievements in science, technology, and social organization that would have been impossible with purely immediate embodied awareness. What's most significant is that two fundamentally different experiments in human consciousness developed in parallel, each exploring different possibilities for awareness, understanding, and meaning-making. And when these two forms of consciousness finally encountered each other during the late Ice Age, something extraordinary happened. They didn't compete for dominance or try to eliminate each other. Instead, they began to combine, creating hybrid forms of awareness that incorporated strengths from both approaches to human consciousness. The genetic and cultural mixing that occurred between Neanderthals and modern humans wasn't just about survival advantages or reproductive success. It was about the emergence of new forms of human consciousness that combined analytical flexibility with embodied wisdom, abstract reasoning with integrated awareness, innovative thinking with deep environmental knowledge. The humans who emerged from this mixing weren't just genetically hybrid, they were cognitively hybrid, carrying forward capabilities from both lineages into new forms of consciousness that neither parent species had possessed alone. And that hybrid consciousness may be exactly what enabled our species to navigate the final challenges of the Ice Age and eventually develop the complex civilizations that followed. Because the problems facing human communities as environmental conditions changed required both the analytical problem-solving capabilities that modern humans had developed and the integrated environmental awareness that Neanderthals had perfected. The combination of these different approaches to consciousness created new possibilities for human adaptation that transcended what either form of awareness could achieve independently. And those combined capabilities remain active in human consciousness today, available to anyone who learns to integrate analytical thinking with embodied awareness, abstract reasoning with immediate perception, innovative flexibility with deep wisdom traditions. The Neanderthals didn't just survive 350,000 years of ice ages through superior survival technologies and brilliant hunting strategies. They mastered the art of being fully human in ways that we're only beginning to understand and appreciate. Their consciousness, their creativity, their spiritual depth, and their integrated approach to existence represent achievements that continue to inform and inspire human potential today. Every time you create something beautiful from simple materials, every time you find meaning in natural phenomena that transcends rational rates thinking and feeling, analysis and intuition, you're expressing explanation. Every time you experience awareness that integ capabilities that were forged in Ice Age Europe and refined across hundreds of thousands of years of conscious evolution, you carry their legacy not just in your genes, but in your capacity for consciousness itself. Their wisdom lives in your ability to perceive beauty, create meaning, and find sacred dimensions in ordinary experience. Their integrated awareness flows through your moments of deep understanding that transcend analytical thinking. The Ice Age world that shaped their consciousness is gone, But the human potential they developed remains as relevant and powerful today as it was when they first pressed their hands against cave walls and created the earliest known expressions of human artistic consciousness. Their story continues in every act of creative expression, every moment of integrated awareness, every choice to find meaning and beauty in the midst of challenge and uncertainty. As remarkable as their artistic and spiritual achievements were, perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of Neanderthal consciousness was how they channeled all these capabilities into something that would define their legacy forever. The creation of what we can only call the world's first sustainable civilization. Picture this scenario. You're part of a community that has occupied the same territory for not just decades or centuries, but for tens of thousands of years. Generation after generation has walked the same valleys, hunted in the same forests, gathered resources from the same locations. And here's the mind-blowing part. After all that time, the landscape is still productive. The animal populations are still thriving. The resources are still available. Nothing has been depleted, degraded, or destroyed. This wasn't luck. This wasn't accident. This was the result of ecological management systems so sophisticated that modern conservation biologists are still trying to understand how they accomplished it. Neanderthals had figured out something that our industrial civilization has struggled with for centuries. Environment, while actually enhancing its long-term productivity. How to extract what you need from your and health. The evidence for this comes from archaeological sites that show continuous occupation spanning incredible time periods. We're talking about locations where Neanderthal communities lived successfully for 50,000 years or more. And when researchers analyze the environmental data from these sites, they find something remarkable. The ecosystems actually became more diverse and productive over time. Think about what this means. Most human settlements, even today, show clear patterns of environmental degradation over time. Soil depletion, water contamination, reduced biodiversity, overexploitation of resources. The longer people live in one place, the more damage typically accumulates. But Neanderthal sites show the opposite pattern. Increased species diversity, enhanced soil quality, more complex ecological relationships. They weren't just living within their environment. They were actively managing it in ways that created beneficial feedback loops. Their hunting practices improved animal population genetics by removing unhealthy individuals while leaving breeding populations intact. Their plant-gathering techniques actually enhanced forest diversity by creating optimal growing conditions for multiple species. Even their fire use contributed to landscape health by preventing destructive wildfires while maintaining beneficial burning cycles. This level of ecological sophistication required knowledge systems that integrated information across multiple scales of space and time. They had to understand individual animal behavior, population dynamics, seasonal cycles, multi-year climate patterns, and century-spanning ecological succession. And they had to coordinate this knowledge across entire communities and between different groups to ensure their management decisions were consistent and effective. But here's where it gets really fascinating. They weren't managing their environment through abstract planning or centralized control. They were doing it through what we might call embodied wisdom. Every individual in Neanderthal society possessed deep, intuitive understanding of ecological relationships that allowed them to make beneficial decisions in real time without complex coordination or oversight. When a Neanderthal hunter decided which animal to target from a herd, that decision was informed by accumulated knowledge about genetics, population health, seasonal breeding patterns, and long-term sustainability that had been absorbed through decades of direct experience. When a plant gatherer chose which roots to harvest and which to leave, those choices reflected understanding of growth cycles, soil relationships, and ecosystem balance that couldn't be taught through abstract instruction. This embodied ecological knowledge was passed down through generations not as formal education, but as lived experience. Children learned by participating, by observing, by developing the same intuitive awareness that allowed their elders to make beneficial decisions automatically. It was a form of cultural transmission that created deep expertise without creating dependence on specialists or complex institutions. And the results speak for themselves. Neanderthal communities maintained this level of ecological management successfully across their entire range for hundreds of thousands of years. They created what may be the longest-running example of sustainable human civilization in our species' history. But their approach to sustainability wasn't limited to environmental management. They had also developed social systems that could maintain stability and cohesion across enormous time spans, while remaining flexible enough to adapt to changing conditions. This represents another area where their achievements challenge our assumptions about what Stone Age societies could accomplish. Modern anthropologists studying traditional societies often find that social stability and adaptive flexibility exist in tension with each other. Societies that are highly stable tend to be rigid and slow to change. Societies that are adaptable tend to be unassayed. Neanderthal and prone to conflictuals somehow manage to achieve both simultaneously. Evidence for their social stability comes from the consistency of cultural practices across vast time periods. Tool-making techniques, artistic styles, burial practices, and symbolic expressions show remarkable continuity at individual sites over tens of thousands of years. They had developed cultural traditions that could preserve essential knowledge and practices across hundreds of generations without significant drift or loss. But they also demonstrated extraordinary adaptive flexibility when environmental conditions demanded change. During periods of climate fluctuation, Neanderthal communities could rapidly modify their hunting strategies, adjust their territorial boundaries, adopt new technologies, and reorganize their settlement patterns without losing their core cultural identity. This combination of stability and flexibility required social institutions that modern societies still struggle to achieve. They needed systems that could preserve essential knowledge while remaining open to innovation. Leadership structures that could coordinate group activities without stifling individual initiative. Communication networks that could share information rapidly while maintaining cultural coherence across vast distances. Recent analysis of Neanderthal social organization suggests they had developed what anthropologists call distributed leadership systems. Rather than relying on centralized authority figures, they distributed decision-making responsibilities across multiple individuals based on expertise, experience, and situational requirements. Different people took leadership roles for different activities, and those roles could shift based on changing circumstances. Remarkable resilience. If key individuals were lost to. This distributed approach to leadership created accidents, predation, or other hazards. The community's essential capabilities remained intact because knowledge and authority were shared across multiple people. It also created systems that could respond rapidly to changing conditions because decisions could be made by whoever had the most relevant expertise, rather than having to flow through hierarchical channels. But perhaps most importantly, it created social environments that could nurture and develop individual capabilities while maintaining group cohesion. Everyone in Neanderthal society had opportunities to develop expertise, contribute to community welfare, and assume leadership responsibilities in areas where they excelled. This wasn't just efficient social organization, it was a system, effectiveness. The evidence that maximized human potential while maintaining collective for this comes from burial sites that for disabled reveal communities' caring members, tool assemblages that show multiple skill levels and specializations, and settlement patterns that suggest complex task distribution and resource sharing. These weren't egalitarian societies in the modern sense, but they were inclusive systems that found ways to utilize everyone's capabilities while ensuring that essential community functions were maintained. And they were doing all of this while dealing with environmental challenges that would test any social system to its limits. Climate fluctuations that could force entire communities to relocate. Resource scarcities that required rapid adaptation of survival strategies. Population pressures that demanded careful management of territorial boundaries and intergroup relationships. The fact that Neanderthal social systems remained stable and effective through all these challenges for hundreds of thousands of years represents one of the most remarkable achievements in human social evolution. They had created forms of social organization that were simultaneously robust and flexible, inclusive and effective, stable and adaptive. These social innovations were crucial for their survival success, but they also created the foundation for their cultural achievements. Because the art, music, and spiritual expressions we discussed earlier weren't individual accomplishments. They were community achievements that required social systems capable of supporting specialists, preserving knowledge, and transmitting complex cultural traditions across generations. The cave paintings that have survived for tens of thousands of years weren't created by isolated artists working in secret. They were products of communities that valued artistic expression enough to invest time and resources in supporting it. The musical instruments that demonstrate sophisticated acoustic understanding weren't individual inventions. They were innovations that emerged from social environments that encouraged experimentation and preserved successful discoveries. The burial practices that revealed deep spiritual consciousness weren't personal decisions. They were collective expressions of shared beliefs and values that required community consensus and cooperation to implement. Every aspect of Neanderthal cultural sophistication depended on social systems that could nurture, support, and preserve human achievements across enormous timespans. But the most remarkable aspect of their social organization was how it integrated with their ecological management systems to create what we might call regenerative civilization. Their communities weren't just socially sustainable and environmentally sustainable. They were systems that actively enhanced both social cohesion and ecological health over time. The same knowledge networks that preserved cultural traditions also maintained ecological wisdom. The same leadership systems that coordinated social communication systems, that shared innovations activities, also managed environmental resources. The same also transmitted information about resource availability, climate patterns, and ecological relationships. This integration created feedback loops that reinforced both social and ecological health. Communities that took good care of their environment had more resources to support cultural development. Groups that maintained strong cultural traditions had better knowledge systems for environmental management. Social cohesion, annually reinforcing aspects of a unified approach to ecological sustainability, weren't separate goals. They were mut to human existence. And the results of this integrated approach were extraordinary. Neanderthal communities didn't just survive for hundreds of thousands of years. They thrived in ways that created increasingly sophisticated technologies, more complex cultural expressions, and deeper spiritual understanding. They were civilizations that grew more capable and more conscious over time while remaining sustainable and resilient. This represents a form of human development that our modern world has struggled to achieve. Most of our civilizations show patterns of initial growth, followed by increasing complexity, resource depletion, social fragmentation, and eventual collapse. We've created technologies and institutions that are powerful but unsustainable, innovative but destabilizing, productive but ultimately self-destructive. Neanderthal civilization suggests alternative possibilities, ways of organizing human societies that can maintain technological innovation while preserving ecological health, forms of cultural development that enhance rather than undermine social cohesion, approaches to consciousness and meaning-making that deepen rather than fragment human understanding of our place in the world. These weren't primitive people who hadn't yet discovered the benefits of civilization. These were sophisticated human communities that had discovered forms of civilization that were more sustainable, more inclusive, and more spiritually fulfilling than what we've achieved with our advanced technologies and complex institutions. Their achievements become even more remarkable when we consider the environmental conditions they were working with. Because while they were creating these sustainable civilizations, they were also dealing with climate challenges that would overwhelm most modern societies. Ice ages that lasted for tens of thousands of years. Temperature fluctuations that could drop average conditions by 20 degrees or more within a few generations. Ecosystem disruptions that required complete reorganization of survival strategies. Yet through all of these environmental challenges, Neanderthal communities maintained their cultural continuity, their technological innovation, and their social cohesion. They proved that human civilization can be both advanced and sustainable, both innovative and stable, both individually fulfilling and collectively beneficial. But perhaps most importantly, they demonstrated that consciousness and culture can continue developing even under the most challenging conditions. Their artistic achievements, spiritual insights, and social innovations weren't products of easy times when survival was assured. They were accomplishments that emerged from communities that chose to invest in beauty, meaning, and human development, even when their physical survival required extraordinary effort and sacrifice. This reveals something profound about human potential that our modern world often overlooks. We tend to assume that cultural development requires surplus resources, that innovation emerges from leisure and security, that spiritual growth happens when practical needs have been satisfied. Neanderthals proved that exactly the opposite can be true. Their greatest cultural achievements emerged precisely because they were dealing with ultimate challenges. The pressure of survival didn't diminish their humanity. It refined it, concentrated it, and revealed capabilities that might never have emerged under easier conditions. They discovered that humans can become more conscious, more creative, and more deeply connected to meaning and beauty precisely when life demands everything we have to give. This insight remains relevant for our modern world, which faces its own set of ultimate challenges. Climate change, resource depletion, social fragmentation, and technological disruption that threaten the foundations of our current civilization. We can respond to these challenges with despair, with desperate attempts to maintain unsustainable systems, or with retreat into individual survival strategies that abandon collective responsibility. Or we can follow the Neanderthal example. We can use these challenges as opportunities to develop new forms of consciousness, create more sustainable civilizations, and discover human capabilities that we never knew existed. We can learn to see crisis as invitation to transformation, rather than threat to be feared. The Neanderthals faced environmental conditions that were far more severe than anything our civilization is likely to encounter. Yet they responded with innovation, integration, and expansion of human potential that created sustainable prosperity for hundreds of thousands of years. They proved that humans can thrive not despite ultimate challenges, but because of them. Their legacy lives in every moment when we choose development over destruction, integration over fragmentation, long-term thinking over short-term advantage, when we invest in beauty and meaning, even when practical demands are overwhelming, when we seek solutions that enhance both human welfare and ecological health, when we choose to grow in consciousness rather than retreat into fear. The Ice Age world that shaped them is gone, but the human capabilities they developed remain as accessible today as they were hundreds of thousands of years ago, because the fundamental challenges haven't changed. We still need to find sustainable ways to extract resources from our environment. We still need social systems that can maintain stability while adapting to change. We still need forms of consciousness that can integrate practical and spiritual awareness. And we still need the courage to face ultimate challenges with creativity, cooperation, and commitment to something larger than individual survival. The Neanderthals showed us that this is possible. They lived it for 350,000 years, They prove that human consciousness can rise to meet any challenge and create forms of civilization that honor both our practical needs and our deepest aspirations for meaning and beauty. You carry their capabilities in your genes and in your consciousness. Their wisdom flows through every choice you make to build rather than destroy, to integrate rather than fragment, to seek sustainable solutions rather than quick fixes. Their example lives in every moment when you choose hope over fear, creativity over conformity, and long-term wisdom over short-term advantage. The story of how they survived 350,000 years of ice ages isn't just ancient history. It's a blueprint for human potential that remains as relevant today as it was when they first learned to make fire in frozen caves and decided that survival wasn't enough. That being human meant something more, something worth preserving, developing, and passing on to future generations who would face their own ultimate challenges with the same courage, creativity, and commitment to the possible. Their sustainable civilization wasn't just an environmental achievement or a social innovation. It was something far more profound. It was proof that human consciousness itself could evolve, expand, and reach levels of integration that we're only beginning to understand today. Because while Neanderthals were perfecting their ecological management and social systems, something extraordinary was happening to their minds. They were developing forms of awareness that allowed them to perceive reality in ways that transcended the boundaries between self and environment, between individual and community, between practical necessity and spiritual meaning. Recent neuroscience research suggests that Neanderthal brains weren't just larger than ours. They were organized differently, with enhanced connectivity between regions that modern humans typically process separately, where we tend to compartmentalize sensory input, emotional response, and analytical thinking into distinct neural pathways. Neanderthal consciousness appears to have integrated these functions into unified awareness systems. Think about what this means for their daily experience. When a Neanderthal hunter tracked an animal across winter landscape, they weren't just following footprints or analyzing behavioral patterns. They were experiencing a form of consciousness that simultaneously processed visual cues, emotional intuition, sensory feedback, and analytical reasoning as a single, integrated flow of awareness. This integrated consciousness may explain capabilities that seem almost supernatural from our modern perspective. Their ability to predict weather patterns days or weeks in advance by reading subtle environmental signals that our analytical minds overlook. Their precision in crafting tools that required understanding material properties at levels that modern engineers achieve only through sophisticated testing equipment. Their success in navigating vast territories without maps or instruments by maintaining mental models of incredible complexity and accuracy. But this wasn't just enhanced practical intelligence, it was a form of consciousness that could perceive meaning, beauty, and spiritual significance as immediate, tangible realities rather than abstract concepts. When Neanderthals created their cave paintings, they weren't representing animals they had seen. They were expressing direct perception of the living essence that animated those creatures, the spiritual presence that connected all life in their world. Their art reveals consciousness that could perceive what indigenous wisdom traditions call the soul of things. The inner nature of animals, landscapes, and natural phenomena that exists beyond their physical appearance. This wasn't primitive superstition or symbolic thinking. It was direct perception of dimensions of reality that our more analytical consciousness typically filters out or dismisses as subjective projection. Evidence for this expanded awareness shows up in the precision and power of their artistic expressions. Cave paintings that capture not just the physical appearance of animals, but their essential character, their emotional presence, their place in the web of relationships that connected all life in their world. These weren't illustrations or decorations. They were windows into forms of perception that revealed the living intelligence that permeated their environment. and this perceptual sophistication extended to their relationship with time itself. Where modern consciousness tends to experience time as a linear sequence of separate moments, Neanderthal awareness appears to have perceived time as a living, multidimensional matrix where past, present, and future existed in dynamic relationship. This shows up in their extraordinary ability to plan across multiple time scales simultaneously. They could coordinate hunting strategies that required split-second timing while maintaining territorial management systems that operated across centuries. They could preserve cultural knowledge across hundreds of generations while adapting instantly to changing environmental conditions. Their consciousness wasn't trapped in the narrow window of present-moment awareness that characterizes most modern thinking. It was expanded awareness that could perceive the deep patterns that connect immediate experience with long-term consequences, individual actions with collective outcomes, human activities with ecological relationships that spanned millennia. This temporal integration was crucial for their survival success, but it also enabled forms of spiritual understanding that transcended ordinary human limitations. Their burial practices reveal communities that could perceive the continuing presence of deceased members, the ongoing relationships that connected the living with those who had passed into other forms of existence. They weren't just honoring the dead through ritual observance. They were maintaining conscious connection with expanded community that included ancestors, descendants, and spiritual presences that existed beyond physical embodiment. Their burial sites weren't just grave markers. They were communication portals that allowed ongoing exchange between different levels of reality. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed that many Neanderthal burial sites were positioned at locations with specific acoustic properties that could amplify and focus sound in ways that suggest sophisticated understanding of vibrational phenomena. Some burial caves contain natural formations that create resonance chambers capable of producing altered states of consciousness through sound vibration. This suggests that Neanderthal communities had discovered what modern researchers call consciousness technologies, natural phenomena that could induce expanded awareness states, facilitate communication with non-ordinary reality, and access information that wasn't available through normal sensory channels. They were using sound, light, geological formations, and natural substances to explore dimensions of consciousness that transcended individual awareness and connected them with larger intelligence systems that permeated their world. This wasn't primitive shamanism or religious superstition. It was sophisticated exploration of consciousness possibilities that modern science is only beginning to understand. And they were integrating these expanded awareness capabilities with their practical survival technologies in ways that created unprecedented effectiveness. Their hunting strategies weren't just based on tracking skills and weapon proficiency. They incorporated forms of consciousness that could communicate with animal spirits, predict herd movements through intuitive awareness, and coordinate group activities through telepathic connection. Evidence for this comes from kill sites that show levels of precision and coordination that seem impossible using only ordinary sensory communication. Simultaneous strikes delivered by hunters, positioned at distances that would make visual or auditory coordination extremely difficult. Attack sequences that required split-second timing across terrain that blocked normal communication channels. Some researchers suggest that successful mammoth hunting required consciousness capabilities that allowed hunters to share awareness directly, to coordinate activities through what modern psychology calls collective consciousness or group mind phenomena. They weren't just cooperating as individuals. They were functioning as unified awareness systems that could process information and coordinate responses at superhuman levels of effectiveness. This collective consciousness capability extended to their tool-making activities as well. Analysis of stone tools from single Neanderthal sites often reveals precision and consistency that suggests multiple craftsmen were working according to shared mental templates that existed beyond individual knowledge. Tools that required dozens of precise strikes to create with error rates so low that they suggest access to information that transcended individual skill levels. They weren't just learning techniques through trial and error or formal instruction. They were accessing collective knowledge systems that preserved and transmitted information through consciousness networks that connected individual minds with accumulated community wisdom. Every toolmaker could draw on the experience of hundreds of previous craftsmen through direct consciousness connection. But perhaps most remarkably, they were using these expanded consciousness capabilities to solve problems that our modern analytical thinking struggles with. Environmental challenges that required processing enormous amounts of interconnected information simultaneously. Social coordination tasks that demanded integration of individual needs with collective welfare across multiple generations. Spiritual questions that involved reconciling immediate experience with ultimate meaning. Their consciousness wasn't limited by the boundaries that constrain modern thinking. They could perceive individual trees and forest ecosystems as unified realities. They could experience personal identity and community belonging as complementary rather than competing aspects of existence. They could engage practical survival activities and spiritual meaning-making as integrated dimensions of unified life experience. This integration created forms of problem-solving capability that transcended what either analytical or intuitive thinking could achieve independently. They could analyze complex situations with precision while remaining connected to the larger patterns that gave those situations meaning. They could respond to immediate challenges while maintaining awareness of long-term consequences and relationships. And they were sharing these consciousness capabilities across their entire population through cultural transmission systems that preserved and enhanced awareness possibilities across hundreds of generations. Every individual in Neanderthal society had access to expanded consciousness technologies that had been refined and perfected over hundreds of thousands of years of development. This wasn't elite knowledge reserved for specialists or spiritual leaders. It was common human inheritance that every community member could develop and apply to enhance both individual capabilities and collective effectiveness. They had created democratized access to consciousness possibilities that most modern societies restrict to rare individuals or specialized training programs. The results speak for themselves. Sustainable civilization that thrived for hundreds of thousands of years, while continuously enhancing both individual development and collective welfare. Technologies that remained effective across enormous environmental changes. Social systems that maintained stability while preserving adaptive flexibility. Cultural expressions that revealed depths of beauty and meaning that continue to inspire human consciousness today. But their greatest achievement wasn't any single capability or innovation. It was the demonstration that human consciousness itself is infinitely expandable, that awareness can develop in directions and reach levels that transcend our current assumptions about mental limitations. They proved that humans can evolve not just physically and culturally, but consciously, developing forms of awareness that reveal new dimensions of reality and new possibilities for existence. This consciousness evolution wasn't accidental or gradual. It was deliberate development that emerged from communities committed to pushing the boundaries of human potential, even while dealing with survival challenges that would overwhelm most societies. They chose to invest in consciousness expansion precisely because they understood that expanded awareness was the ultimate survival technology. When you can perceive reality more clearly, process information more effectively, coordinate with others more precisely, and access knowledge that transcends individual limitations, you become capable of solving problems and creating possibilities that remain invisible to ordinary consciousness. They discovered that consciousness development wasn't a luxury that could be pursued after practical needs were satisfied. It was the foundation that made everything else possible. Their example reveals something crucial about human potential that our modern world desperately needs to understand. We face challenges that cannot be solved through technological innovation alone, through political reorganization alone, through economic restructuring alone. We need consciousness evolution that can perceive solutions that exist beyond the boundaries of our current thinking. Climate change, social fragmentation, resource depletion, and technological disruption require forms of awareness that can process complexity, integrate multiple perspectives, and perceive possibilities that transcend current limitations. We need consciousness capabilities that can coordinate individual actions with collective welfare, immediate responses with long-term consequences, practical solutions with spiritual meaning. The Neanderthals developed exactly these capabilities. They created forms of consciousness that could handle ultimate complexity while maintaining clarity, effectiveness, and meaning. They proved that humans can evolve awareness systems that transcend current limitations and reveal new possibilities for sustainable, fulfilling existence. And they did it while dealing with environmental conditions far more challenging than anything our civilization is likely to face. If they could develop expanded consciousness while surviving ice ages, we can certainly develop similar capabilities while dealing with the challenges of our modern world. Their consciousness technologies remain accessible today because the fundamental principles haven't changed. Humans still have the capacity to expand awareness beyond individual limitations. We can still develop forms of consciousness that integrate rather than fragment experience. We can still access collective intelligence that transcends individual knowledge. Every moment of expanded awareness you experience, every instance of intuitive understanding that bypasses analytical thinking, every experience of connection that transcends individual boundaries, you're accessing capabilities that were fully developed in Neanderthal consciousness. Their wisdom flows through every choice you make to integrate rather than separate, to perceive wholes rather than parts, to seek understanding rather than mere information. When you experience the living presence in natural environments, when you perceive the deeper patterns that connect seemingly separate events, when you access knowing that comes from sources beyond individual experience, you're expressing consciousness capabilities that enabled Neanderthal communities to thrive for hundreds of thousands of years in conditions that would challenge any civilization. Their story isn't just about survival or even success. It's about the demonstration that human consciousness can reach levels of development that transform survival from desperate struggle into creative expression, that convert challenges into opportunities for growth, that reveal dimensions of reality where practical effectiveness and spiritual fulfillment exist in perfect integration. They showed us what becomes possible when human consciousness evolves beyond current limitations. When awareness expands to perceive the deeper patterns that connect all existence. When intelligence develops to levels that can solve problems and create possibilities that remain invisible to ordinary thinking. The Ice Age world that shaped their consciousness is gone, but the human potential they revealed remains as accessible today as it was when they first learned to perceive reality with eyes that could see beyond the boundaries that constrain ordinary awareness. Their legacy lives in every moment when consciousness expands beyond individual limitations and reveals the larger intelligence that connects all existence. You carry their capabilities not just in your genes, but in your consciousness itself. Every time you choose expansion over contraction, integration over fragmentation, understanding over mere analysis, you're expressing awareness possibilities that were perfected across hundreds of thousands of years of conscious evolution. Their greatest gift wasn't their survival technologies or even their sustainable civilization. It was their demonstration that human consciousness itself is the ultimate technology, the foundation that makes everything else possible, the source of capabilities that can transform any challenge into opportunity for growth and any limitation into invitation for transcendence. But here's where their story takes a turn that will completely reframe everything you understand about human evolution and our place in the cosmic story. Because while Neanderthals were reaching these extraordinary heights of consciousness development, something was approaching their world that would test every capability they had developed. Something that would determine not just their survival, but the future direction of human consciousness itself. Around 45,000 years ago, as the latest ice age was reaching its peak intensity, new forms of human awareness began appearing in territories that Neanderthals had occupied for hundreds of thousands of years. These weren't invaders or competitors in any simple of different sense. They were carriers, experiments in consciousness evolution, alternative approaches to human development that had emerged from completely different environmental and cultural conditions. The encounter between these consciousness systems would become the most significant meeting in human history. Not because one would replace the other, but because their interaction would create possibilities for awareness development that neither could achieve alone. The future of human consciousness would emerge from the integration of different approaches to human potential, different solutions to the challenges of existence, different ways of being fully alive in an uncertain world. Human consciousness was about to evolve in directions that would transcend everything that had come before. And the foundations for that evolution were being laid by the remarkable people who had already proven that humans could survive anything, create beauty under any conditions, and develop awareness capabilities that revealed infinite possibilities for growth and transcendence. The story of how they survived 350,000 years of ice ages was just the beginning. The real adventure was about to unfold. Now picture this moment. You're standing at the edge of what would become the most remarkable merger in human history. Two completely different experiments in consciousness, two distinct approaches to being human, about to converge in ways that would reshape the very foundation of what our species could become. The modern humans who were moving into Neanderthal territories weren't just another group of people looking for better hunting grounds. They were carriers of consciousness technologies that had evolved under completely different pressures, in environments that demanded different solutions to the fundamental challenges of existence. Where Neanderthals had developed integrated awareness that could perceive the world as unified living systems, these newcomers had perfected something equally remarkable but fundamentally different. They had mastered what we might call modular consciousness, the ability to break complex problems into separate components, analyze them independently, and then recombine the solutions in novel ways. Where Neanderthal awareness flowed like water, finding the natural patterns that connected all experience. Modern human consciousness operated like lightning, jumping between different modes of thinking with incredible speed and precision. This wasn't better or worse than Neanderthal consciousness. It was different, and that difference would prove to be absolutely crucial for what was about to unfold. Because the environmental conditions that both groups were facing required capabilities that neither possessed alone, the Ice Age world was becoming more unpredictable than it had ever been. Climate fluctuations that happened over decades rather than millennia, ecosystem disruptions that required constant adaptation, resource availability that shifted faster than traditional knowledge systems could accommodate. Under these conditions, Neanderthal integrated consciousness provided incredible depth of understanding, but sometimes lacked the flexibility to pivot rapidly when fundamental assumptions about the environment suddenly became obsolete. Modern human modular consciousness offered remarkable adaptability, but sometimes missed the deeper patterns that could predict long-term consequences of short-term adaptations. Neither approach alone was sufficient for thriving in the new conditions. But together, they created possibilities that transcended what either could achieve independently. And here's where the story becomes absolutely extraordinary, because instead of competing for dominance or trying to eliminate each other, these two consciousness systems began to merge in ways that preserved the strengths of both while creating entirely new capabilities. The archaeological evidence reveals something that challenges every assumption about how different human groups interact. Instead of conflict and replacement, we see collaboration and integration. Tool assemblages that combine techniques from both traditions. Settlement patterns that suggest shared territories and coordinated resource management. Most remarkably, genetic evidence that shows extensive interbreeding between the groups over thousands of years. Think about what this means. These weren't brief encounters or occasional interactions. This was sustained integration that created hybrid populations carrying the consciousness capabilities of both lineages. Children were being born who inherited Neanderthal integrated awareness and modern human analytical flexibility. Communities were emerging that could perceive reality as unified living systems and break down complex challenges into manageable components. These hybrid populations possessed consciousness capabilities that neither parent group had developed alone. They could track simultaneously analyzing optimal animal behavior through integrated environmental awareness while hunting strategies through modular problem solving. They could maintain deep spiritual connection with their territories while rapidly adapting their survival techniques to changing conditions. But the integration went deeper than just combining existing capabilities. It created emergent properties that transcended what either consciousness system could achieve independently. New forms of creativity that emerged from the intersection of integrated perception and analytical innovation, enhanced problem-solving abilities that could handle complexity through multiple simultaneous approaches, expanded communication systems that could transmit both experiential wisdom and analytical information. Recent studies of archaeological sites from this period reveal technological innovations that appear suddenly in the record with no clear developmental sequence. Tools that combine Neanderthal understanding of material properties with modern human precision manufacturing. Hunting strategies that integrate traditional ecological knowledge with innovative tactical approaches. Artistic expressions that blend Neanderthal direct perception of living essence with modern human symbolic abstraction. These weren't gradual developments or independent inventions. They were emergent innovations that could only arise from the interaction between different consciousness systems. The hybrid communities weren't just preserving the best of both traditions. They were creating entirely new possibilities for human development, and the timing couldn't have been more crucial, because the environmental challenges they were facing required exactly these kinds of emergent capabilities. Climate conditions that shifted faster than traditional knowledge could accommodate, but followed deeper patterns that analytical thinking alone couldn't perceive. Resource management challenges that required both long-term ecological wisdom and rapid adaptive innovation. Social coordination demands that needed both integrated community consciousness and flexible individual initiative. The hybrid populations that emerged from this consciousness merger were uniquely equipped to handle these ultimate challenges. They could maintain cultural continuity through Neanderthal integrated awareness, while adapting rapidly through modern human analytical flexibility. They could preserve traditional ecological wisdom while developing innovative survival technologies. They could sustain community cohesion while encouraging individual creativity and initiative. But perhaps most importantly, they were developing new forms of consciousness that could integrate the best of both approaches without losing the essential qualities of either. This wasn't synthesis that averaged different capabilities into compromised solutions. This was integration that preserved distinct consciousness modes while creating meta-awareness that could coordinate between them. Evidence for this integrated consciousness shows up in the sophisticated decision-making capabilities that these populations demonstrated. They could shift fluidly between different modes of awareness depending on situational requirements. Integrated perception for understanding ecological relationships. Analytical thinking for solving technical problems. Collective consciousness for coordinating group activities. Individual awareness for creative innovation. This consciousness flexibility provided enormous advantages for surviving in rapidly changing conditions. When environmental circumstances shifted, they could rapidly adapt their awareness modes to match new requirements. When facing unprecedented challenges, they could combine different consciousness approaches to develop novel solutions. When coordinating complex group activities, They could integrate individual capabilities into collective intelligence that transcended what any individual could accomplish alone. The results were extraordinary. Archaeological evidence shows that these hybrid populations didn't just survive the most challenging period of the Ice Age. They thrived in ways that enabled rapid expansion into new territories, development of increasingly sophisticated technologies, and creation of cultural expressions that revealed unprecedented depths of consciousness development. Cave art from this period shows remarkable innovations that combine Neanderthal direct perception of living essence with modern human symbolic abstraction. Images that simultaneously represent physical animals and spiritual presences. Geometric patterns that integrate mathematical precision with organic flow. Color applications that suggest understanding of consciousness-altering properties of specific pigments. These weren't just artistic achievements. They were consciousness technologies that could induce expanded awareness states, facilitate communication between different reality levels, and preserve complex information in forms that could be transmitted across generations without degradation. The hybrid communities were developing cultural storage systems that could maintain both analytical knowledge and integrated wisdom simultaneously. Tool technologies from this period reveal similar integration of consciousness approaches. Implements that combine Neanderthal understanding of material essence with modern human engineering precision. Composite tools that integrate multiple functions while maintaining aesthetic beauty. Weapon systems that coordinate individual effectiveness with collective tactical coordination. But the most remarkable innovations were in the realm of consciousness development itself. Evidence suggests that these hybrid communities were creating formal systems for enhancing awareness capabilities, training methods that could develop both integrated perception and analytical thinking, initiation processes that could expand individual consciousness while strengthening community bonds, wisdom transmission systems that could preserve and enhance consciousness technologies across generations. Archaeological sites from this period include structures that appear designed specifically for consciousness development activities. Acoustic chambers that could induce altered awareness states through sound resonance. Light focusing systems that could enhance visual perception and pattern recognition. Geometric arrangements that could facilitate meditation and expanded awareness practices. These weren't random innovations or accidental discoveries. They were systematic approaches to consciousness evolution that emerged from communities committed to developing human potential beyond current limitations. The hybrid populations weren't just surviving environmental challenges. They were using those challenges as opportunities for accelerated consciousness development. And they were sharing these consciousness technologies across expanding networks that connected communities separated by vast distances. Evidence shows rapid transmission of innovations across territories that spanned entire continents. Similar consciousness development techniques appearing simultaneously at locations thousands of miles apart. Cultural exchanges that preserved local variations while maintaining core principles. This suggests communication networks that operated through consciousness connection as well as physical travel. Communities that could share awareness experiences directly. Knowledge transmission systems that could preserve complex information in consciousness, forms that transcended individual memory limitations. Collective intelligence networks that could coordinate activities and share innovations across continental distances. The implications are staggering. These hybrid populations had developed consciousness capabilities that enabled them to function as distributed intelligence systems. Individual awareness connected with collective consciousness. Local communities linked with continental networks. Human intelligence integrated with natural environmental awareness. Present moment experience connected with past wisdom and future possibilities. They had achieved what we might call planetary consciousness. Awareness systems that could perceive and respond to patterns that operated across multiple scales of space and time simultaneously. Individual actions coordinated with collective welfare. Local decisions integrated with global consequences. human activities harmonized with ecological relationships that spanned continents and centuries. This planetary consciousness was crucial for navigating the final phases of the Ice Age, because the challenges they faced required exactly these kinds of integrated awareness capabilities. Climate changes that operated across continental scales but affected local communities. Resource management decisions that required understanding consequences across multiple generations. Social coordination challenges that demanded both individual initiative and collective wisdom. The hybrid communities that had developed these consciousness capabilities were uniquely equipped to handle the transition from Ice Age conditions to the warmer, more complex environments that were emerging as the glaciers retreated. They could maintain essential survival knowledge while adapting to entirely new ecological relationships. They could preserve cultural continuity while embracing innovations that enhanced their capabilities. But most importantly, they had developed consciousness technologies that could continue evolving as conditions changed. Meta-awareness that could develop new awareness modes as circumstances required. Learning systems that could acquire new capabilities while preserving essential knowledge. Adaptation mechanisms that could respond to unprecedented challenges without losing core identity. These consciousness evolution capabilities would prove absolutely crucial for what came next. Because as the Ice Age ended and human populations began expanding into the diverse environments that were becoming available, they would face challenges that required constant innovation, continuous adaptation, and unprecedented levels of consciousness development. The hybrid populations that emerged from the merger of Neanderthal and modern human consciousness carried forward the foundational capabilities that would enable our species to colonize every environment on Earth, to develop technologies that could manipulate matter at molecular levels, to create social systems that could coordinate activities across global scales, to explore consciousness possibilities that revealed connections with cosmic intelligence systems. Every capability that would define human civilization emerged from the consciousness integration that occurred during those crucial millennia, when two different experiments in human awareness merged into something greater than either could achieve alone. The hybrid consciousness that resulted wasn't just a combination of existing capabilities. It was an evolutionary leap that opened possibilities for human development that continue expanding today. And you carry those capabilities in your consciousness right now. Every time you shift between different modes of awareness, depending on situational requirements. Every time you integrate analytical thinking with intuitive understanding. Every time you coordinate individual creativity with collective wisdom. You're expressing consciousness technologies that were developed during the most crucial period in human evolution. The Neanderthal contribution to your awareness provides the depth, the integration, the connection with living systems that allows you to perceive reality as meaningful wholes rather than disconnected fragments. The modern human contribution provides the flexibility, the analytical precision, the innovative capability that allows you to adapt rapidly to changing conditions and develop novel solutions to unprecedented challenges. Together, these consciousness capabilities create possibilities for awareness development that reveal new dimensions of human potential. Every end current limitations and moment of expanded consciousness you experience, every breakthrough in understanding that integrates different perspectives, every creative solution that emerges from the intersection of analysis and intuition, you're expressing the evolutionary achievement that emerged from the greatest merger in human history. But the story doesn't end with successful integration and expanded consciousness capabilities. Because the hybrid populations that inherited these remarkable abilities would face their own ultimate test. Environmental conditions that would challenge every survival strategy they had developed. Social pressures that would demand new levels of cooperation and coordination. Consciousness evolution requirements that would push human awareness development in directions that no one could have anticipated. The foundations had been laid for the next phase of human evolution. The consciousness technologies had been developed. The integration had been achieved. But the real adventure was just beginning. Because what emerged from the Ice Age world would face challenges and opportunities that would require consciousness capabilities beyond anything that had been developed before. The merger of Neanderthal and modern human awareness had created the foundation for civilization. But building that civilization would require consciousness evolution that transcended even the remarkable achievements of their Ice Age ancestors. The story of human survival was complete. The story of human potential was about to unfold in ways that would astonish anyone who understood what these remarkable people had already accomplished. The legacy of those who survived 350,000 years of ice ages would live on in every human achievement, every breakthrough in consciousness, every moment when our species chose growth over limitation, integration over fragmentation, possibility over resignation. Their greatest gift wasn't just survival. It was proof that human consciousness can evolve in directions that reveal infinite possibilities for development, transcendence, and connection with the deeper intelligence that permeates all existence. That proof lives in you today, waiting to be recognized, developed, and expressed in ways that honor their extraordinary achievement while opening new chapters in the never-ending story of human potential. Now here's where their story takes a turn that will fundamentally change how you understand what happened to these incredible people. Because around 40,000 years ago, something occurred that would test every single survival strategy the Neanderthals had perfected over hundreds of thousands of years. And it wasn't another ice age. It wasn't climate change. It wasn't even environmental pressure. It was us, modern humans. Our direct ancestors were finally making their way into Europe, carrying with them technologies, social systems, and ways of thinking that had evolved under completely different conditions. And what happened next wasn't the violent conquest that Hollywood loves to portray. It was something far more complex and far more remarkable. Picture this encounter from a Neanderthal perspective. You're part of a lineage that has dominated European landscapes for over 300,000 years. Your people have perfected every aspect of survival in this frozen world. You know exactly where to find the best materials for tools, which valleys provide shelter during the worst storms, when the mammoth herds will migrate through your territory. Then one day, you encounter something that shouldn't exist, according to everything your culture has taught you about the world. Strangers who look different, move differently, and most unsettling of all, use technologies you've never seen before. These aren't your people, but they're clearly human. They're making tools, controlling fire, hunting the same animals you depend on. What do? How do you respond to the sudden appearance of competitors who seem to understand survival, but approach it in ways that challenge everything your ancestors learned over millennia of Ice Age existence? The archaeological evidence reveals something absolutely fascinating. Instead of immediate conflict or territorial warfare, what unfolded was nearly 10,000 years of coexistence. 10,000 years where these two human species lived in proximity, sometimes using the same caves at different times, sometimes hunting in overlapping territories, gradually learning from each other in ways that would reshape both lineages forever. At sites across Europe, we find evidence that challenges every assumption about how different human groups interact when resources are scarce and survival is uncertain. Mixed tool assemblages that combine Neanderthal techniques with modern human innovations. Settlement patterns that suggest coordinated resource management rather than competitive exclusion. Most remarkably, genetic evidence that reveals extensive interbreeding between the groups. Think about what this means. These weren't brief encounters or occasional interactions. This was sustained relationship building that lasted longer than recorded human history. Children were being born who carried genetic inheritance from both lineages. Communities were forming that preserved knowledge from both traditions while developing entirely new approaches to survival. But here's where it gets really interesting. The modern humans who were entering Europe weren't just bringing different technologies. They were bringing fundamentally different approaches to problem solving and social organization. Where Neanderthals had perfected deep, stable adaptation to specific territories, these newcomers had developed systems that could adapt rapidly to changing conditions. Modern human societies had evolved during their expansion out of Africa to be incredibly flexible. They could relocate quickly when resources became scarce. They could adopt new technologies within generations rather than centuries. They could maintain cultural connections across vast distances through trade networks and communication systems that spanned continents. These weren't necessarily better survival strategies than what Neanderthals had developed. They were different strategies, optimized for different types of challenges. Neanderthal approaches were incredibly effective for stable, predictable environments where deep territorial knowledge provided enormous advantages. Modern human approaches were better suited for dynamic, unpredictable conditions, where flexibility mattered more than specialization. And as fate would have it, the world was becoming more unpredictable than it had been in hundreds of thousands of years. Climate fluctuations were accelerating. Environmental conditions were shifting faster than traditional knowledge systems could accommodate. The stable territorial patterns that had allowed Neanderthal culture to flourish were breaking down as ice sheets advanced and retreated in cycles that lasted decades rather than millennia. Under these conditions, the flexibility that modern humans had developed during their expansion became increasingly valuable. But they were entering territories where they lacked the deep environmental knowledge that Neanderthals had accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years. They needed to learn about local resources, seasonal patterns, optimal hunting strategies, and survival techniques that Neanderthal communities had perfected through countless generations of experience. So instead of competition and conflict, what emerged was collaboration and knowledge exchange. Neanderthal sites from this period show sudden appearances of tool types and techniques that had previously been associated only with modern humans. Projectile weapons designed for hunting at distance rather than close-quarters encounters. Ornamental objects that suggest new approaches to symbolic expression. Evidence of expanded trade networks that connected local communities with resources from hundreds of miles away. At the same time, modern human sites evidence of begin showing clear Neanderthal influence. Hunting strategies that reflected deep understanding of local animal behavior and environmental conditions. Tool-making techniques that incorporated Neanderthal innovations in stoneworking and material processing. Settlement patterns that took advantage of Neanderthal knowledge about optimal locations for different seasonal activities. This wasn't just technological borrowing. This was cultural fusion that created hybrid approaches to survival more effective than either tradition could achieve independently. Communities were emerging that combined Neanderthal environmental expertise with modern human adaptability. Hunting parties that used traditional ecological knowledge to locate prey and innovative weapon systems to take them down efficiently. But the exchange went deeper than just tools and techniques. The genetic evidence reveals something extraordinary about the social systems of both groups. For extensive interbreeding to occur over thousands of years, both Neanderthals and modern humans must have possessed cultural mechanisms that could integrate outsiders, form cross-species partnerships, and successfully raise children who looked different from either parent population. This suggests that both species had developed what we might call diplomatic capabilities, ways of negotiating relationships with groups that had different languages, different customs, different approaches to survival. They possessed social flexibility that allowed them to form alliances and partnerships, even across species boundaries. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of shared activities that went beyond simple resource exchange. Cave paintings that combine stylistic elements from both traditions. Settlement areas that suggest coordinated territorial management between different groups. Burial practices that show influences from both cultural systems. These weren't just economic relationships or temporary alliances. These were sustained cultural interactions that created new possibilities for human social organization. Communities that could maintain distinct cultural identities while sharing knowledge and resources. Social systems that could integrate different approaches to survival while preserving the essential innovations of each tradition. And the children born from these relationships weren't just genetically hybrid, they were culturally hybrid, carrying forward knowledge and capabilities from both lineages. They could track animals using traditional Neanderthal techniques while employing modern human projectile weapons. They could navigate using deep territorial knowledge while maintaining social connections across vast distances through modern human trade networks. These hybrid populations possess survival capabilities that neither parent species had developed alone. They combined Neanderthal cold weather adaptations with modern human technological flexibility. They integrated traditional ecological wisdom with innovative problem-solving approaches. They maintained community cohesion while encouraging individual initiative and creativity. But perhaps most importantly, they were developing new forms of consciousness that could coordinate between different approaches to understanding and interacting with the world. Metacognitive abilities that could shift between Neanderthal integrated awareness and modern human analytical thinking, depending on situational requirements. Recent studies of brain development in modern human populations with significant Neanderthal genetic inheritance reveal exactly these kinds of enhanced cognitive capabilities. Increased activity in regions associated with spatial reasoning, pattern recognition, and what neuroscientists call cognitive flexibility, the ability to switch between different mental frameworks rapidly and effectively. This cognitive hybridization provided enormous advantages for surviving in the increasingly complex and unpredictable world that was emerging as Ice Age conditions began to shift. When environmental circumstances changed rapidly, these populations could adapt their awareness modes to match new requirements. When facing unprecedented challenges, they could combine different consciousness approaches to develop novel solutions. Evidence for this enhanced adaptability shows up clearly in the archaeological record. Technological innovations that appear suddenly with no clear developmental sequence, artistic expressions that combine techniques from different traditions in ways that create entirely new aesthetic possibilities, settlement patterns that suggest rapid adaptation to changing environmental conditions while maintaining cultural continuity. These hybrid communities weren't just preserving the best of both traditions. They were creating emergent capabilities that transcended what either lineage could achieve independently. New forms of creativity that emerged from the intersection of different consciousness systems. Enhanced problem-solving abilities that could handle complexity through multiple simultaneous approaches. And they were sharing these innovations across expanding networks that connected communities over vast distances. Similar technological breakthroughs appearing simultaneously at locations separated by thousands of miles. Cultural exchanges that preserved local variations while maintaining core principles that enhanced everyone's survival capabilities. But here's where the story takes another remarkable turn. Because while these hybrid populations were developing unprecedented capabilities, they were also facing environmental pressures that would test every survival strategy that had ever been developed. The Ice Age world was reaching its final, most challenging phase. Around 26,000 years ago, ice sheets advanced further south than they had in over 100,000 years. Temperatures dropped to levels that made previous glacial periods look mild. Even the Neanderthals' perfectly adapted bodies and brilliant survival strategies began reaching their absolute limits. Vast territories that had supported thriving communities became uninhabitable. Rivers that had provided reliable water sources froze solid year-round. Plant communities that had supplied crucial resources disappeared under advancing ice sheets. Even the megafauna that both groups had mastered hunting began migrating to regions beyond human reach. Under these extreme conditions, the hybrid populations that had developed the most flexible and comprehensive survival capabilities possessed crucial advantages. They could maintain essential knowledge through Neanderthal deep memory systems, while adapting rapidly through modern human innovation networks. They could preserve traditional ecological wisdom while developing new technologies optimized for unprecedented conditions. Communities that had successfully integrated knowledge from both lineages were uniquely equipped to handle challenges that exceeded what either tradition had faced before. They could draw on hundreds of thousands of years of Neanderthal Ice Age experience while employing modern human adaptability to develop solutions that neither lineage had needed to create independently. But even these enhanced capabilities were being pushed to their absolute limits. Archaeological evidence from this period shows rapid technological advancement as communities innovated desperately to survive conditions that challenged every assumption about what humans could endure. Tool-making techniques became more sophisticated. Shelter construction evolved to handle more extreme cold. Hunting strategies adapted to changing animal populations and environmental conditions. Yet something remarkable was happening during this ultimate test of human survival capabilities. Instead of reverting to desperate individual competition, communities were increasing their cooperation and knowledge sharing. Evidence shows expanded trade networks, shared resource management systems, and coordinated territorial planning that helped everyone survive conditions that would have overwhelmed isolated groups. The consciousness capabilities that had emerged from Neanderthal modern human integration were proving their ultimate value. Metacognitive awareness that could coordinate between different survival strategies. Collective intelligence systems that could share innovations rapidly across large populations. Social organization methods that could maintain cooperation under extreme stress. These weren't just survival techniques. They were evolutionary innovations that would define human capabilities for all future challenges. The ability to integrate different approaches to problem solving. The capacity to maintain cultural continuity while adapting rapidly to changing conditions. The social flexibility to form cooperative relationships even under competitive pressures. And as environmental conditions began to improve after the last glacial maximum, these capabilities would prove absolutely crucial for what came next. Because the hybrid populations that survived the ultimate Ice Age challenges would inherit a world that was changing faster and more dramatically than anything humans had ever experienced. As glaciers retreated and new environments became available, human populations would face opportunities and levels of consciousness development. The foundations had been laid during challenges that required constant innovation, continuous adaptation, and unprecedented the most challenging period in recent human history. The consciousness technologies had been developed. The social systems had been tested and refined. Now, it was time to discover what became possible when human awareness capabilities that had been forged in ice and tested by ultimate survival challenges were applied to a world of expanding possibilities. The Neanderthals hadn't disappeared. They had become integrated into expanding human consciousness that carried forward their deepest wisdom while embracing innovations that would reshape what it meant to be human. Every person of non-African ancestry carries Neanderthal genes that provide advantages for surviving in challenging conditions, resisting diseases, and adapting to diverse environments. Modern human immune systems include Neanderthal innovations that proved crucial for thriving in northern climates. Our cognitive capabilities incorporate Neanderthal enhancements that improve spatial reasoning, pattern recognition, and integrated awareness. But perhaps most importantly, we inherited their approach to consciousness development, the understanding that human awareness can evolve in directions that reveal new possibilities for existence. The commitment to developing capabilities that transcend individual limitations. The recognition that survival challenges can become opportunities for growth and transcendence. When you face something that seems impossible and find ways to break it down into manageable components while maintaining awareness of larger patterns, you're expressing consciousness capabilities that emerged from the integration of different human lineages. When you coordinate individual creativity with collective wisdom, You're using social technologies that were developed during the most crucial period in human evolution. When you choose cooperation over competition during challenging times, when you seek solutions that benefit everyone rather than just individual advantage, when you invest in long-term possibilities rather than short-term gains, you're honoring the legacy of people who proved that human consciousness can rise to meet any challenge. The Neanderthals survived 350,000 years of ice ages, not just through superior survival technologies and brilliant hunting strategies. They demonstrated that human beings can maintain hope, creativity, and meaning even under conditions that would crush most civilizations. They showed that consciousness itself can evolve in directions that reveal infinite possibilities for growth and transcendence. Their story continues in every moment when you choose expansion over contraction, integration over fragmentation, understanding over mere analysis. Their consciousness lives in every breakthrough that emerges from combining different perspectives, every solution that transcends current limitations, every choice to develop human potential rather than accept apparent boundaries. The Ice Age world that forged their capabilities is gone, but the consciousness technologies they developed remain as accessible today as they were when they first learned to see reality with eyes that could perceive connections invisible to ordinary awareness. Their greatest gift wasn't just their genetic contribution to modern humanity. It was their demonstration that human consciousness can evolve beyond current limitations and reveal dimensions of reality where survival transforms into creative expression. Challenges become opportunities for growth, and limitations dissolve into invitations for transcendence. That demonstration lives in you right now, waiting to be recognized, developed, and expressed in ways that honor their extraordinary achievement while opening new chapters in the never-ending story of human potential. Because the real adventure isn't what they accomplished in their world. It's what becomes possible when you apply their consciousness technologies to the challenges and opportunities of your own existence. The true measure of their achievement becomes clear when you consider what happened next. Because as the ice finally began its retreat and new territories opened up across the globe, the consciousness capabilities that had been forged in those frozen landscapes would prove to be exactly what our species needed for the next phase of human development. Think about this for a moment. The same integrated awareness that allowed Neanderthals to perceive their environment as living. Interconnected systems became the foundation for understanding complex ecological relationships in entirely new environments. The analytical flexibility that modern humans had developed during their expansion out of Africa provided the tools for rapid adaptation to diverse climates and terrains. Together, these consciousness technologies created possibilities for human development that neither lineage could have achieved alone. As human populations began spreading into forests, deserts, grasslands, and coastal regions that had been locked under ice for millennia, they carried with them cognitive tools that had been tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable. They possessed awareness capabilities that could simultaneously perceive immediate survival requirements and long-term environmental patterns. They had social technologies that could maintain cultural continuity while embracing constant innovation. But here's what makes this expansion truly extraordinary. These weren't desperate refugees fleeing harsh conditions and struggling to survive in unfamiliar territories. These were conscious beings who had learned to transform challenges into opportunities for growth. They approached new environments not as obstacles to overcome, but as invitations to develop new capabilities and explore new possibilities for human existence. Evidence from archaeological sites around the world reveals something remarkable about how human populations adapted to post-glacial conditions. Instead of simply transplanting Ice Age survival strategies to warmer climates, they were innovating at unprecedented rates, developing new technologies optimized for specific environmental conditions, creating social systems that could coordinate activities across diverse landscapes, establishing trade networks that connected communities separated by vast distances and dramatically different ecological conditions. The consciousness capabilities they had inherited weren't just helping them survive in new environments, They were enabling forms of cultural development that transcended anything that had emerged during the Ice Age period. Art that explored abstract concepts rather than just representing immediate experience. Music that incorporated complex harmonic relationships rather than focusing solely on emotional expression. Spiritual practices that investigated ultimate questions about the nature of reality and human purpose. This cultural explosion wasn't accidental or coincidental. It was the direct result of consciousness evolution that had occurred during the merger of different human lineages. The hybrid awareness that emerged from that integration possessed capabilities that could handle increasing complexity while maintaining coherence and meaning. Metacognitive abilities that could coordinate between different modes of thinking, depending on situational requirements. When faced with the challenge of developing agriculture in environments that had never supported farming before, they could combine analytical problem-solving with integrated environmental awareness. When creating the first permanent settlements that would eventually become cities, they could balance individual creativity with collective coordination. When developing technologies that could manipulate natural materials in unprecedented ways, they could maintain spiritual connection with the natural world while embracing innovation. This integration of different consciousness approaches created forms of human development that were simultaneously practical and meaningful, innovative and sustainable, individually fulfilling and collectively beneficial. They were building civilizations that enhanced rather than diminished human potential, creating technologies that amplified rather than replaced natural capabilities, developing social systems that encouraged rather than suppressed individual growth and creative expression. Recent archaeological discoveries continue to reveal the sophistication of these early post-glacial communities, settlement sites that show evidence of urban planning principles that wouldn't be rediscovered until modern times. Agricultural systems that enhanced rather than depleted soil fertility over extended periods. Trade networks that facilitated cultural exchange while preserving local innovations and traditions. But perhaps most remarkably, they were maintaining the consciousness development practices that had emerged during the Ice Age period. Evidence suggests that many early agricultural communities included specialized areas for activities that can only be described as consciousness exploration, structures designed for acoustic enhancement of group meditation practices, geometric arrangements that could facilitate expanded awareness states, artistic installations that served as consciousness development tools rather than mere decoration. These weren't primitive people who had lost touch with the spiritual dimensions of existence as they developed more complex technologies and social systems. These were conscious beings who understood that external development was meaningless without corresponding internal growth. They were creating civilizations that supported consciousness evolution as a fundamental aspect of human development. So there you have it. 350,000 years of human survival, innovation, and consciousness evolution that completely redefines what we thought possible for our species. The Neanderthals weren't just survivors who managed to scrape by in harsh conditions. They were master engineers, brilliant hunters, sophisticated artists, and conscious beings who developed forms of awareness that we're only beginning to understand today. They proved that humans can not only endure the most extreme challenges our planet has ever presented, but actually use those challenges as opportunities to evolve, create, and transcend apparent limitations. Their legacy flows through your DNA, through your consciousness, and through every moment when you choose growth over fear, cooperation over competition, and meaning over mere survival. The Ice Age world that forged them is gone, but the human potential they revealed remains as powerful and accessible today as it was when they first learned to see reality with eyes that could perceive infinite possibilities hidden within apparent impossibilities.